All right, welcome everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started here. I can see some of you are, I should say good morning, and for some of you, I should say good afternoon, and for some of you, good evening. So welcome to you all. And this is our webinar by Ron Darvin, Devices, Designs, and Algorithms. Before we get started with the main event, I'm just going to tell you about a couple of other upcoming opportunities that we have through Circle. For those of you who are new to Circle, Circle is one of 16 national language resource centers in the US. We're located at the University of Arizona and the College of Humanities. And together with the other 16 language resource centers, we form a network that helps to support language educators locally, but also around the world. So if you don't already know our work, please do check out our website. We have a number of other events as well as other kinds of materials to share, and all the other centers do too, and we have slightly different emphases. In addition to this event, this is part of a webinar series for this semester. So we have a couple of upcoming events that I want to highlight. In particular, on November 6th, Building Bridges Across Cultures Through Global Inquiry with Children, which is by Kathy Short and Doria Klecker. Sign up and registration for that is still open. And then December 6th, we'll have Language Learners Become Filmmakers, Connecting STEM, Digital Literacies, and our Language Arts Classroom by Veronica Ogilvy, Jill Kastick, and Jessica Summers and Leah Falco. So those are both events where registration is still open that are coming up. If you've missed any of the previous events, in particular the Translating Google Translate webinar, that's closely connected to the event that we're going to have today, we will also have recordings of that available soon on our website. So look for that. And then the final event that I wanted to highlight that's coming up is in January, our international conference on intercultural competence. This is a virtual event this time, and we have three really amazing plenary speakers, Uju Anya, Maria Dasley, and Jennifer Pipitone. So registration will be coming for that soon as well. And those of you who are all over the world, wherever you are, can participate since this will be a virtual event. Without further ado, I want to turn now to our webinar for today by Ron Darvin, Devices, Designs, and Algorithms. I want to tell you just a little bit about Ron Darvin's work first. He's Assistant Professor of Applied Linguistics at the English Department of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And his research focuses on issues of language and literacy learning, technology, and critical pedagogy. And he's published really extensively in these areas. There are so many wonderful articles that I didn't want to highlight just one, but topics related to the digital age and identity. And I really encourage you to check out his work if you haven't already. His study, Digital Identities, Educational Inequities, Investigating Social Class and New Literacies of Migrant Filipino Youth in the Knowledge Economy, was recognized in 2020 with the highly competitive dissertation award from the American Association of Applied Linguistics. And he was also the recipient of an Emerging Scholar Award from the Language and Social Processes Special Interest Group of the American Educational Research Association. He's conducted multiple workshops on teaching critical digital literacy for both in-service and pre-service teachers. So we're really delighted to have him here with us today. And so he'll be talking about strategies for integrating critical digital literacy in the language classroom. Please join me by welcoming Ron Darvin.
Yes. Okay. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I can see there are people from different parts of the world, from Egypt, from Greece. I know it's like 1 or 2 a.m. right there right now. So thank you for being here. And I hope it's going to be worth your while to be up this late to hear me speak. But for today, I'm here in Hong Kong. It's 7 a.m. And it's the best way to start a Saturday morning. So today my talk is on devices, designs, and algorithms. And the one thing that that makes me so excited to talk about is that it's touching on critical digital literacy, which I feel very passionately about, and it's something that I will try to define further later on in my talk. But one of the reasons that this is an area that I've been particularly interested in, especially in the past 2 years, as you can imagine, when many of us were thrust into online teaching, having to deal with many different systems, learning management systems, using Zoom, using Google Classroom, etc. Because we know that as we allow ourselves to participate in kind of like these online spaces, that there are things that change, right? And what changes because of that, because of the different devices that we use, the different platforms that we use, is something that I wanted to share with you this morning. Now, from the very start, I wanted to talk about a couple of students in the research that I've conducted in Vancouver with Filipino students from several years ago. And one of them is Jimmy, who's 15. And in my research, I asked Jimmy, oh, can you tell me about kind of like how you work on your science homework, right? And Jimmy was going through his textbook and he encounters the word immune. And it says, so how do you figure out kind of like what the word immune means, right? Because he said it was a word that he wasn't really familiar with. And so he says, oh, I usually turn to Google Translate, right? And I know for those of you who were in the talk with Emily and Kimberly from a month ago, where they talked about Google Translate, right, in the language classroom. For Jimmy, he goes to his phone and he inputs immune on Google Translate and looks for the Filipino translation. And quickly he enters it and he looks at the blue box that shows up on his phone and says, oh, there's no translation for immune, right? And he moves on. And I realized that, when I look at his phone, clearly there were actual translations that were listed below the blue box in Filipino, which were listed as alternate translation. And what I thought about was that, when our students use these tools, there are certain patterns in the way knowledge or information shows up that they become familiar with, that for Jimmy, finding the translation meant looking at this blue box and not looking anywhere else, right? And when you think about, like, why is it that the other translations of immune in Filipino didn't show up in the blue box? Well, the reality is, if you may not know, is that when we think about Google Translate, a lot of the data, the translation data that it's based on, right, is on European Parliament proceedings, where they would have side-by-side translations of different languages, whether it's Spanish or French or German or whatnot. And so you would expect that when it comes to looking for translations into these languages, that there are greater chances that the translation would be a good translation. Whereas when it comes to kind of what we call less resource-rich languages online, where you would not have that many side-by-side translations of different languages like Filipino, the chances of you finding an accurate translation for certain words in English, for instance, would be slightly less, right? And so when we look at what Jimmy has encountered, right, and being able to look at that blue box and not looking anywhere else, you realize that this kind of layout also is something very specific to phones, right? That if Jimmy were to look at a browser from a laptop or desktop, you could see that, yes, just like in his phone, there is no translation of immune that appears on the box on the right, but it's not shaded in blue. Of course, it's a bigger screen, and therefore there's a lot more that you could see, where you are directed to what's called translations of immune below, where you could see all the other translations in Filipino. And it also even allows you to look at definitions of immune. So in that case, when it comes to the browser with looking at it from a screen that is much bigger, it directs you to a lot more information that enables language learning, right? The other participant in my study is Penny, and uh, I would show Penny kind of like different websites and different pages from social media, and I would ask her what she thought the particular platforms were for. And one thing that that I shared with her was this post from Imgur, which is a photo sharing website from years ago. And as you can see here in this particular example, it's a picture of kind of like what looks like kind of deformed flowers. And the caption reads, "Not much more to say. This is what happens when flowers get nuclear birth defects." And if you tie that into what is the title of this picture, it refers to what was a nuclear leak in Fukushima, and supposedly this is what happened to the flowers there because of that leak. And when I asked Penny, right, "Oh, what do you think is this post for, the purpose of this post?" She takes one look at it and reads the caption and says, "Oh, maybe it's to give knowledge about nuclear defects," right, as the caption suggested, and stuff, or nature. And you realize that when it comes to recognizing what would be a legitimate source of information, how Imgur is not really a science website, how it is a photo sharing website, how if you look at the one who uploaded the picture, right under the title, it says, "Please Google Shaker Armor," etc., that it would not appear to be a legitimate source. But then how Penny interprets a particular post as legitimate, the genre in which it is presented, is something that she does not have much of a critical awareness of, right? Which leads me to the question of like looking at Jimmy and Penny. What does it mean, right? When we go online and we are directed to different sources of information, whether it's translation of a word, whether it's looking at different posts, and how does the device, uh, how does the design of a particular platform, and how do the algorithms that read the data of what would be an appropriate translation for a word would be, how does this shape our experience of going online? And what does that mean for our students who would have different ways of navigating these spaces and recognizing what would be legitimate information or not? And this is where I bring in the concept of uh, critical digital literacy, and what that is, I'll define further later for you later on. Uh, and also, what does it mean when we integrate critical digital literacy in the language classroom? Right now, first question, right? What's the big deal about devices, designs, and algorithms? Right? And I thought I'd think about kind of like in a situation where you're on a date with someone, right, in a fancy restaurant, and a woman, let's call her Rachel, decides to talk up to her boyfriend, um, Henry, about rabbit, her pet rabbit, right? And you realize the moment that she starts talking about the rabbit, the fact that they are face to face with each other, she's not bringing out visual aids, she's not bringing out pictures of her rabbit, that the way she uses language to be able to talk about this rabbit would be very different if instead she had posted something about her rabbit on Instagram and sent a link to her boyfriend, right? And that the moment that you choose a platform like Instagram to talk about your pet rabbit, that there are many different things that that shape this communicative interaction, right? Whether you chose the right filter, the caption, whether through the algorithms it actually is directed to the feed of her boyfriend, whether she posted it using her phone versus did you look at this Instagram post from your browser, right? That there are many different layers that we do not necessarily see that shape this particular interaction. And that's not any different from the moment that we have right now, where we're all on Zoom, right? That whether you are looking at this presentation from, as I am, on a 27-inch iMac, where I may have my notes on the left, I may have kind of like my screen in the middle and my slides, right? And how the way I direct my gaze, whether I'm looking straight into the camera or looking to the on my notes or whatnot, that again, this shapes the way people respond to this particular interaction, right? At the same time, if we're to access this, this presentation using your phone, you realize that while it is the same platform and while you're listening to the same person, how you have to navigate through this platform, what kind of information or images are you able to access at any given time would be different as well, right? Whether you have to swipe to the left to be able to participate in a specific way, means that there is something about the device, again, that shapes everything that has to do with our communicative moment. And if you think about, for us as language teachers, where we are talking about what it means to use language in different communicative contexts, right? Whether you are visiting a country in where the language you are learning is spoken, or you are on a date, what does it mean for us to also be able to talk about, well, what does it mean when we use these different platforms and these serve as the mediating context in which interaction happens, right? Which, if you think about it, is actually very central to what we talk about when we teach language to our students. Now, there's all the different tools that we use for the classroom. There are different tools that we use for everyday life, right? If you use Tinder, for instance, the dating app, you might wonder, well, Tinder is always using on your use on your phone because it has to deal with you being in a specific location where you are able to swipe left or swipe right, right? And if you wonder what is it that allows me to see some people within my 5-kilometer radius or not, what directs certain profiles to my account, right? Again, that has to do with algorithms that are usually proprietary. That is, we do not know exactly what these algorithms are, because these are, these are the secrets of these companies. They don't always reveal these things, but that you can infer in the process as you keep on using these tools. And when you think about Tinder, right? Tinder used to at least use what's called an ELO score, which is not unlike chess, where how certain profiles are directed to you and how you are rated as a user, as a human being using Tinder actually comes with many different components, right? That I don't know if you know this, but the how you are rated in terms of your attractiveness is based not only on your picture, right? But how many people like your picture, how many people swipe right or left, but not just that. For those people who liked you, what are their ELO scores in terms of attractiveness? Because if they're popular and they liked your profile, the higher the score that you would get, right? And so what you realize is that there's a whole dynamic going on that we don't see, where we as human beings are being evaluated, processed based on certain ways of thinking of who a good match would be, right? In fact, I don't know if you've heard of Badu, which is another app. I don't think it's as popular, but one of the things that they do have is actually a feature where if you're someone who's crazy about Michael Bublé, for instance, and you're looking for uh, people who look like Michael Bublé, you can just click on Michael Bublé, and what they do is they're able to, through AI, uh, read kind of like facial features of different users to be able to find who would look like Michael Bublé and feed it to your, you know, and send these profiles to you. In fact, you can even, if you're hung up on your ex, upload a picture of your ex, and again, the app will look for users who will look like your ex, which I'm not sure is a healthy thing to do at all. But again, we see how uh, there are different algorithms that are at work every time we use these tools. And what are algorithms really, if not coded instructions that a computer needs to be able to perform a given task, right? They're there to deploy, they're deployed to make a decision to sort all the data that we provide on the web, to be able to determine where you should go and what kind of information you receive. And that's why when you look at one particular beauty contest that they did kind of like several years ago, um, which is the first international beauty contest judged by AI, right? Where people were asked to send in their pictures um, to compete, right? In terms of who the AI will decide would be the most beautiful people online. These were the results at the bottom. You'd find or the where the winners for, I think it was those in their 20s, male, right? And if you look at the pattern of who got chosen, because there were like thousands of people, so you can imagine, who sent their pictures in, you could see that the images of those who won are actually all white, right? And one of the reasons for this, even though they received kind of entries from all over the world, was that when it came to the facial recognition patterns, the data that this program was able to read, it really depended on what kind of data that the programmers put into the system to begin with, to be able to start reading images, right? And so if there were no diversity in the data or the images that were uploaded in the first place, then predominantly what it would recognize are images of a specific group that dominated kind of like the data that was uploaded earlier, and would reflect, therefore, the results that you've had later. And that's why when we listen to all these talk about kind of like AI and how it's the machine that decided to do this, right? Because it's been fed specific data. We know that all this information that we have, uh, even though you say, you know, it's gone through machine learning, it's fed by all this data, but how certain data are provided for the machine to learn is again, of course, provided by specific people. And that's why, while it is a black box where we don't know how exactly things work necessarily, because again, the algorithms are proprietary, we do know, and it's always important to remember, that in the end, these tools are designed by people, right? And that whether consciously or unconsciously, that people embed kind of like their own ways of thinking, their own biases and assumptions into the design of certain platforms, of these algorithms that would then, in the end, decide who gets to be beautiful, who is sent to your Tinder profile, what kind of definitions you will get when you go on Google Translate, right? And that, just like the design of any room or any space in which a communicative event takes place, where you could walk straight ahead or you would hit a wall and you would have to turn left and go through a door, that the platforms that we use have been designed with a very specific purpose as well, right? Uh, and that means, you know, whether it's about scrolling infinitely, that allows us to keep on staring at our phones and therefore produce data that that would be profitable for the particular platform, as opposed to like Google, when you conduct a Google search, where they would have a pagination at the bottom for you to recognize, you know, if you're moving on from one page to the next, right? Even when you think about the very act of refreshing stuff on your phone, where you drag it with your thumb downwards and it goes up, right? For you to see, well, what changes? What is my phone gonna send me this time? And some people have said, you know, that's not unlike slot machines, right? Where you go down and you wait for what numbers appear, what if there are cherries that appear on your slot machine for you to win or not, right? And that part of that design makes it addicting in that way. Yeah. When you think about the prompts that we have on our different platforms, I don't know if you recall when Twitter started years ago, right? The prompt that would ask people, you know, what are you doing, right, was what shaped the practices that followed, right? And that's why, if you remember, like, Twitter used to be a place where people would say, oh, I'm walking to work now, oh, I'm having my coffee, and I'm like, why do I have to know what you're doing every 5 minutes? But that was what Twitter's like, until it decided to change the prompt to what's happening, right? And because of that, it became a space where people thought that, you know, they would have to share what was important was happening in a particular community, a local community that they were at. And that's why Twitter became a source of news, real time, for when things happened, and a place for sharing ideas. And so the point is that when we think about these designs, right, they're not just there because they're pretty, right? That the design features of a platform, the layout, the components, the buttons, are there because, yes, they have a way of uh, uh, directing us to certain behavior, to perform specific social actions. But at the same time, how they are arranged uh, shapes also, or are there because they serve very technical purposes of collecting data, of collecting information that would translate, as I've said, into profit for a company. And that's why when you think about, again, if I go back to Tinder or another dating app like Grindr, you could see how the moment we choose to input information about ourselves on the profile, the categories that we find, whether it's asking me to talk about me in 500 characters, right? Uh, and how it prioritizes, it starts with asking for my job title or my company, already indicates a specific way of thinking of what would make you a good person to date or meet, right? On the right, you'd have Grindr, a dating app for gay men, where the questions or the categories are also different, where they're asking you about your age, your height, your weight, your body type. Again, reflects a certain way of thinking of what would make a good date, right? And so the personal profile template, as you can see, are ways of defining identity within a fixed set of standards to be compatible with the algorithmic logic driving these systems, right? Which is not unlike, hashtags, right? Hashtags aren't there at the end of your post just for you to sound cute and say hashtag outfit of the day, OOTD, or hashtag blessed, or whatever, right? It again, it is a way of classifying information so that people can be directed to the information that they're interested in. And that again is information that is collected by a company. So that even when we're looking for information like who it is I want to meet on these apps, the filters that are provided, again, reflect a certain way of thinking of, well, what kind of liberties, what kind of freedoms should we have in terms of narrowing down who it is that we can see, whether it's their age, whether it is their 400 meters away or 5 kilometers away, whether it's about their weight or their height or their ethnicity, right? And if we know, if we didn't know, right, all these different apps, for instance, like when you talk about Tinder and Match and Plenty of Fish, right? Uh, that they actually all belong to one company, which is the Match Group. And interestingly enough, several years ago, I was at the office of Plenty of Fish, which is in Vancouver, and I asked one of the kind of like the PR people, when I said, well, how do people get kind of like the certain profiles and not other profiles? And I don't know if she should have shared this with me, but the woman working there said, oh, years ago when there was just one owner of Plenty of Fish, it wasn't owned by Match.com. The owner one evening said, who's a programmer, says, oh, I don't think I want people to meet others who are 12 years younger than them or 12 years older than them, right? And so it only took him one evening to tinker around with the algorithms so that by default, if you are a user of Plenty of Fish, then you would not see anyone who's more than 12 years older than yourself. When you think about why 12 years, it's all pretty arbitrary, right? But then you see how we get directed to certain spaces is really determined by the decision of one person, a group of people, and that these decisions that are made shapes not only how we are provided specific content, but at the same time, what kind of data we provide these different platforms, which become then a specific cycle where it is very easy for us to be trapped in our own filter bubble, where it's limited by what it is that we want, and we get what we want. But then, while we talk about the internet being an open place where everyone gets a chance to meet, that the reality is that we are being ushered into very specific spaces, into very fragmented spaces. And that's why when we think about what's important for language teachers and learners in recognizing all these spaces, that there are very particular ways technologies influence not only the way we use language on these spaces as we create our profiles, right? But that there are consequences in terms of the way we use them in these ways. And that these social consequences of using specific platforms shape the way we are directed to specific information or meet other people. Which brings me to the point of what it means then to develop a more critical digital literacy for our students to learn this, right? And if you look at critical digital literacy, oftentimes I think, if we think about digital literacy first, right? Uh, there is a tendency, I believe, to conflate that with educational technology. And what is educational technology? It's the platforms that I shared earlier, right? Whether you're using Kahoot or FreshGrade or Padlet. Uh, Digital literacy is not about using specific tools, right, to learn language. But actually, it is quite the reverse. Digital literacy for me is, if you talk about literacy, reading and writing, it really is, well, how do we use language to be able to use these tools, right? So as opposed to a specific ability to use these technologies, for me, it is what appears on the right, that is, it's what people do with not just language, but other semiotic resources to use technology. It's the practices, the social practices of communicating, relating, thinking, and being that is associated with digital media. Because if we choose technology to mediate our interaction, our day-to-day lives, the reality is technology is not neutral. As you've said, there are many different layers that are at work every time we use these technologies. And that when we look at these layers, while it's true that we need certain functional digital literacies, where we are able to use our linguistic and semiotic resources to do what we want with these tools, to be able to allow it to function based on our own intentions. The reality is that as we navigate our way through these tools, because of the design, because of the devices that we use, because of the algorithms, that these tools also have the power to shape very different practices, right? And that these practices, that this behavior can serve the intention of others, right? In this case, software developers, advertisers, other users, right? And that for me is the critical element to it, right? It's not just about how to use it, but asking, why is it that we use it a certain way, right? And what is it about language that we need to focus on, and these other multimodal components that we need to pay attention to, so that we can read and write more critically when we go online. And so that leads us to the question of, well, if we're to integrate this critical component to digital literacy in the language classroom, uh, what exactly does it involve, right? And for me, when I think about these digital literacies and being able to understand this, yes, there is a bit of communication theory that is involved in it. but it's also knowing the different linguistic and rhetorical conventions that are associated with very specific digital genres. And the reason for me that genre is the way to be able to talk about this is that genre, by its very nature, is about how there are different communicative events, right, that are tied to specific communicative purposes. That is, if we talk about using these tools with our own intentions to achieve certain uh, um, social purposes, that at the same time, the design itself of these platforms reflect the purposes of others, right? Uh, and when we talk about kind of like these purposes and being able to think about, the language classroom, the communications classroom, what does it mean for us to be able to talk about genre and online genres while we are expected to teach our students specific genres that they will need for school, right? And that's where I wanted to share real quick, kind of like um, a particular uh, course design that I have for here in the university where I teach, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, where I was tasked to redesign the communication classes for freshmen, for English majors who are freshmen, um, and be able to integrate digital literacies into this space where they were expected also to come up with what would be the more traditional kind of like genres, like the literary analysis essay or the personal reflection essay or a research essay, right? And this linked to, again, a recognition, of course, of genre pedagogy, where learning language is through recognizing it through genres, where it is about bridging activities, where we ask students to bring in the genres, the texts that they encounter in their lives outside of school, and we try to bridge it with the kinds of texts and literacies that we want them to learn in school, right? And I see one question that that want someone needing clarification. What do I mean by digital genre? It's not just that it's online activities themselves, but that when we produce, let's say, when we go on Facebook, for instance, and we're tasked to introduce ourselves through our profile, that the profile itself is a particular genre. It's a format of using language to achieve a specific purpose, right? For me, going on Google and searching for results and interpreting the results that you have and trying to extract what it is that would be relevant information for you, because that is a specific intention. That itself, the Google results page and navigating your way and knowing, just like how you're able to read through chapters in a book, and we let them recognize what it means to read a book or a journal article or a story, would be a genre, right? And that means, well, apart from it being process oriented, where the approach here, where we ask them to do things step by step, right? Uh, it really boils down to understanding the rhetorical situation, right? Where we need to always ask, well, who is the audience, right? What genre or type of text is it, right? Uh, and in what context does the communication take place? What is the medium that is being used? In this case, a platform or a device, right? And again, what is the purpose driving the author's choices, right? So it is about reading or looking for or understanding the text in terms of what the purpose is. And for me, for a bridging studies approach or a bridging activities approach, the first thing is to allow students to use authentic text. And for me, what is it about authentic text, right? To be able to look at, Instagram accounts that they use and being able to understand the rhetorical situation of these texts. Being able to look at even the discussion forums that you may be using in your learning management systems. In our case, it's Blackboard, where we ask students to participate in these forums or chats. Uh, but at the same time, we recognize that they're not just like chats on Facebook, because they're on an academic learning management system where they know the audience is not just their friends, but their professor is reading the chat, how it shapes the interaction, and how, in this case, the teacher would be the one to be able to facilitate the conversation. Well, how do we begin to read? What would be the convention or the expectation in using these specific tools, right? So knowing how, how these texts that they encounter day to day work, I asked them to bring maybe a screen cap of a social media post that would best represent them, right? uh, I asked them to bring a screen cap of an ad of an influencer that they follow, for us to talk about methods of persuasion online. In producing an essay, a research essay in class, it's not just intended to be something submitted to me. It's printed out as an kind of like an ebook that is shared with everyone else. Or I ask them to come up with a YouTube video where, again, the audience are actual people out there who may be able to click on this link and watch the video that they've produced, rather than their teacher or just their classmates being able to see what it is they do. The other thing is allowing space for multimodality. And I guess this is no surprise for us. We recognize that, in the language class, more and more, we realize that we can no longer just speak of uh, examining language, but then we recognize that a lot of um, our interaction online, especially, and if we want them to produce authentic text, means being able to understand how certain images work to be able to communicate certain meanings, and how they're not just because, again, that they're pretty, but they are ways to organize information, right? For us to be able to process the kind of information and produce texts that are readable, that people can digest. What does it mean to choose the right soundtrack for the video that you're producing, so that it aligns with the message that you want to send? And that even comes with understanding all these different emojis, which will have very specific conventions online, right? If you're on Snapchat and you have streaks with your friends, where you're expected to keep your streak alive by sending messages to each other, or sending pictures or snaps within 24 hours, and how your relationship, based on how often you're able to snap with each other, then define it's based on the kind of interaction that that ways of interpreting what your relationship is with these people are then highlighted by the different emojis that are used, right? And not to mention, when it comes to even searching for legitimate information online, right? In my research, I would show students this page, and I ask them, what do you think about this page? Is it legitimate or not? And they see ABC News, and they might have said, oh yeah, I've heard ABC News. That must be pretty legit. But you realize that, it takes a way of looking at images for you to look at that logo and realize that is not the logo of ABC News. This is the logo of ABC News. And that if you were to direct your eye to the URL, where you see it's called abcnews.com.co, that while abcnews.com is legit, abcnews.com.co is not legit, because as you can imagine, .co is just like the country extensions that we have. In Hong Kong, it's HK, in Canada, it's CA, etc. .co is from Colombia, but you don't have to be in Colombia to be able to use this extension. You just have to pay for that extension. And people, because they look at the URL and don't see the extra CO and think it's just .com, that they do not realize that they are looking at a completely different website. And sometimes it's a matter of looking at, the handle. The BBC News UK is legit, but the handle BBC News UK with the extra I is not. Recognizing that if you go on Twitter and there are news accounts that use hashtags, that you would recognize based on the conventions that these are not the conventions of using hashtags in news accounts. These are hashtags for your Instagram account, but not necessarily hashtags for something like the New York Times, where you would have it embedded in the text and highlighted as links, right? And so for me, multimodality is not something extra in the language classroom. It is actually part of the assessment when they produce these videos, because it is about being able to examine these spaces and examining these multimodalities to be able to process information, to decode information online. The last point that I wanted to make is how, again, just as I pointed out earlier, that it is another thing to be able to examine the materiality of these platforms. That is, whether you are watching a video from your phone or your browser, that again, you are directed to different information. That when you think about the design of Instagram, the moment that you are asked to follow someone versus friend someone on Facebook, that shapes, again, a very different interaction, because in this case, there is a culture of influencers, because there is people there. You create accounts where there are people who are followed more than they have followers, right? Whereas in Facebook, when you friend someone, where you begin to see the post of the one who you've accepted as a friend, because there is a certain mutuality when it comes to the relationship that is generated through Facebook. If you go on TikTok, you realize that even though they ask you to add or follow people, when you go through the feed, the default of it is actually not the posts of people you are following, but a For You tab, where it really depends on your interest at that moment. TikTok has such a powerful algorithm that it reads what you are interested in or viewing it at the moment. If you watch a video for 4 seconds, if you skip through it, if you watch the whole 15 seconds, if you rewatch it, it will determine what would be the next video that you will watch as you scroll down, right? And you'll see how the many different ways in these profiles are designed shape many different ways of performing different identities, right? And even again, when you go on learning management platforms, the question of, well, how do we begin to have the language to be able to engage in this particular genre of interaction? which may have features, may have similar features with those that we encountered day to day, that are again negotiated in the different contexts in which this platform is used, right? To recognizing also that even the moment that we have we interact with students on the platform, that the teacher has certain powers in determining who it is who can speak or not speak. The settings where students can delete their own posts or post stuff anonymously, again shape the different interactions. Or even when they feed their text to, I don't know what you may use in terms of plagiarism detection software in your educational context. But for us, it's very guide, where you realize that the way they interpret what plagiarism is, and students need to understand this, right? Is how is plagiarism understood by this machine, right? That is, again, uh, all these platforms will have very different conceptions of what would be considered copying and what would be considered fair use of this information. And so, which brings us back to that idea that we started with, right? That whether it is for academic context or very informal personal context, like going on a date, that or meeting people, that the moment that we uh, use these tools to mediate our interactions, that we need to recognize that the genres that we encounter, that we produce, that we consume, are not just pages, genres on a flat page on a piece of paper, right? But that there are so many layers that happen beneath that page uh, that are part of our understanding how this genre is produced. And so the challenge that I leave to you as fellow language teachers, right, is 5 questions. That is, when we think about uh, the reality that that we're in right now, where we use these tools are part of our everyday. First, a very fundamental question that we need to ask is, well, to what extent do we recognize digital literacy as a critical component of the language classroom? Do we think that it is something that uh, it should be reserved for after they learn what would be the traditional print literacy? Or do we acknowledge that the reality that our students are faced with is that they move across digital and print text, right? And that they are reading and consuming information, and actually perhaps more so online. That if our role as language teachers for us to be able to equip them with the language and literacies that allow them to gain information and to interact with different people every day. How do we position digital literacy in terms of the way we design our class? And not only that, when we think about these digital literacies that are so much a part of our everyday that it becomes so natural, right? For us, we think, oh, email is so natural because it's so part of our everyday. And we think that our students need to learn how to use email, when in fact, the practice of using email is something that is very specific to our experience. And what does it mean for students to be able to think about the platforms that they do use to exchange information, whether it's Snapchat or TikTok? How does this shape what do we think are the digital literacies that should be taught in the language classroom? What are these digital literacies that matter? And that is, how do we equip students with the critical digital literacy to recognize how these different technologies shape our identities, our behavior, and our beliefs? And more so, how are we how comfortable are we to learn about continually emerging online genres with and from our students? Because the reality is, when we talk about these genres, they are not just, as I'm not just talking about the very fixed, oh, email is an online genre or blog is an online genre, but that as you navigate these different spaces and you use these platforms with very different intentions, these genres continue to evolve, right? And that there are multiple genres online, and that we can't possibly know all these things. And that means allowing our students to bring in the genres that they are familiar with, the platforms that they're familiar with, and for us to be able to examine these genres with them. Uh, and finally, if we think about the digital as a space for uh, our students to collaborate, right? The question is, well, to what extent do we ourselves as teachers collaborate with fellow teachers to discover new ways of integrating these digital literacies for us to move forward in terms of integrating these literacies into our classroom? Because in the end, the objective really is that if we recognize that we live in an age where interaction communication happens online and offline, uh, the question is, how do we reimagine language learning and teaching so that learners can participate with greater agency to be able to communicate with and achieve the intentions, the purposes that they want, and to be able to determine what is this information, to understand how they are being directed in certain ways so that they can claim the right to speak and claim the right to understand what the digital has to offer us. That's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This is really wonderful. I want to start by just amplifying some of the praise that I see in the chat, people saying how important this is and how engaging the examples are. I know I'm going to be processing the information about how Tender works probably for the next few days. It strikes me that, we talk about appropriately, using language appropriately, but we don't often pair that up with some of the things that you're pointing out about the less sort of instrumental aspects of that, like, are we using it in a way that's toxic or addictive to us, which I think is really thought-provoking. We have some questions I want to bring in from over in the Q&A area, and please feel free to keep adding more. So one is has to do with and I think you showed some examples from the Blackboard, for example, in the work your student was doing. In what ways should we or can we also think about this critical approach as a digital genre, or how the critical approach itself intersects with the kinds of digital genres that you're talking about?
Well, for sure. So, and this is why it's a very good point that you raised there, because for me, learning these digital literacies from the functional to the critical, it's not a linear process, right? That as we engage with these different genres, yes, we are allowing them to be able to think about the rhetorical situation, to know in what registers are appropriate for this particular genre, right? What are the particular linguistic patterns that we may find, the scripts that we would encounter, kind of like when we engage in, let's say, a chat or a discussion forum. But at the same time, the moment that we talk about the rhetorical situation where we are expressing different intentions and we're talking about context and medium, that already is right away a critical component of how to understand what I regard as the critical, right? That is, we realize that the way we access this, first of all, can be very different depending on the materiality of where we're looking, and understanding, well, how does it get fed to us? I would show, like, my students all these settings that I have that they might not see, right? Because that's the power the teacher has in these learning management systems. So these are things that they have to understand it, because these are the ways that they are being evaluated. I don't know if you check your learning management platform, but I have a setting where I can take a look at how much they've participated throughout the term, where they've commented, how many times, how many words they've inputted in the learning management system through the course of the term. And I think these are things that shape the way we think about our students. And I think that's where our students need to understand also. So our critical understanding of that, and also for students to know how these things work.
Yeah, that's really interesting because it brings in that kind of critical reflection as also part of professional learning for teachers, not just as practice for the classroom, but in thinking about how they shape our own forms of assessment, et cetera. There's a couple of interconnected questions that are about the ways in which language might be degrading through the use of social platforms, or how do you push students to think about the ways in which digital literacy practices are changing and shaping language? And do you see, related to that, certain kind of pros and cons of getting them to engage with digital literacy practices, maybe versus or in connection with other kinds of things that you might be doing in the classroom?
For sure. And this, and that's a question that, you know, I always get asked, right, when I talk about digital literacy. And oftentimes, right, as teachers, we look at their work and I'm like, oh my gosh, this student has LOL in the research essay written on, like, you know, and you know, this doesn't fit. And we think about, does it really, I think the word you use is degraded, right? First of all, I think the paradigm that we need to recognize also is that when we think about language, right, that language is a living, breathing thing, right? If we think about the way we use language now, we don't talk like Shakespeare, do we, right? Like a language continue to, and in fact, if I did talk like Shakespeare right now, you would think, oh my gosh, there's something wrong with Ron Darvin, right? But language continues to evolve, and the reality is, like every generation, things will change because of the technology. You know, our own teachers would have taken a look at our work then when we were high school students and say, oh my gosh, what are my students doing to language, right? But I think that recognizing that there are many different ways to use language, creative uses of language that happen outside the academic context, is key. And for me, again, recognizing or having a critical awareness of genres is to recognize that, well, we use this kind of language, this text speak, outside of school because it's there for a reason, right? We talk about, oh, you know, acronyms coming out, the shortening of words, contractions, because there is limited space online, because we're asked to chat by typing. And that's why this becomes kind of like a convention online, as opposed to an essay that you're supposed to submit in the classroom, where you are given 2 weeks to type it up neatly in complete sentences. And again, it's showing that one is not just wrong. It's just that, you know, one is convention, the text is a convention for a specific genre of communication. And understanding actually how the rhetorical situation works in that particular context is something that can be extended to an understanding of rhetorical situations of academic text online.
I think that's a really helpful example of genre as well, as you've been talking about it. There's a couple of questions that are both in some way about curriculum that I'm going to tie together. So one is, especially in curricula where maybe you have a very rigid set of things that you're working with, for example, in K-12, what recommendations do you have for bringing in this approach where there's already a curriculum that you can't control? And then the related question is then also tied to that other part of curriculum, which is assessment. Do you have ideas of how we can assess the kinds of learning that you're talking about as well?
Again, this is a very important question, of course, because we recognize that as language teachers, we are shaped by the curriculum that is handed down to us. And just like, you know, there are software developers and there are app technology companies that kind of structure the way engagement has to happen online. We recognize that there are also institutions that determine what it is that we can do or not do in the classroom. And I think one answer that I have there is that, well, it does happen, through time, right? And that's why I think it's important in whatever context that you have, that these conversations have to happen grassroots from the teachers so that it is expressed into the different forums in where it could shape curriculum, national curricula, and design. But at the same time, I would think that while there may be specific objectives that would conform to what would be considered the more traditional literacies, I think in the classroom there can be spaces. They might not be huge spaces, right? But then being able to talk very quickly about bringing in some text and making that connection, for me, does not mean a complete deviation, because you are still talking about specific genres and comparing it with those that they encounter online. And so for me, it's more like finding different spaces and hoping that organically and by having greater conversations that it does lead to kind of a realization how things have to change in the process. But it is a long process, that's for sure.
I think this is a question that in some ways also dovetails with this, which is one of the questions is recognizing that you're not just talking about particular kinds of texts or particular kinds of communication that you're bringing in, but particular kinds of instructional activities that you would then couple with those. Can you just expand a little bit more on that, on kind of what sorts of instructional activity or what does this look like in the classroom?
So for me, the key is being able to talk about authentic texts, and the reason I highlight that is that the importance is for us to allow students to bring in the literacies that they do have, right? And I think that that's often a missing piece, because yes, we are expected to teach certain literacies that we want them to learn. But in the same way that we talk about translanguaging, for instance, where we say, oh, if we're letting them learn a second language, all their languages that they speak are resources to be able to learn a second language. I'd say that, well, the reality is, in the same way that we want them to learn specific academic literacies, to be familiar with specific academic genres, why don't we bring in all the different literacies that they encounter as well? I think that is the avenue there, because if it's something that they're familiar with and they know it and they can claim it and they could say, well, because this is what Instagram is about, and be able to allow them to use the language of rhetorical situations or genre analysis to be able to say, well, this is audience, this is kind of like purpose and the text and the medium. That by generating that kind of genre awareness, that it does extend to them learning the genres for school.
And then a question that also kind of picks up there in terms of the assessment, what does that look like in terms of, does that also then need to be technology based, or how do you connect the kind of bridging that you're talking about between academic genres and digital literacy practices to the kinds of assessment that you would favor?
Oh yes, thank you. That's a very important piece, right? Because earlier I showed you kind of like the rubric for my evaluating, let's say, the video that they had produced, where part of it is multimodality, right? Did you choose the right images? Are the images appropriate? You didn't choose them randomly just because they're pretty, but that they are part of the communication. But I do not include in the assessment kind of like how flashy, how great the resolution is. And these are things that we need to be aware of, right? Because first, if again, we're very aware that people have very different access to devices and apps, that the quality of the work in terms of the technical aspect of how high the resolution is, and it looks like a movie, right? Can shape our impression of, oh, this is good work, right? And so I often tell the students, like, I'm not looking at how flashy your video is, but I am looking at how appropriate the images that you use are, the soundtrack that you use, rather than them being able to edit it in a way that required very specific devices that not everyone would have access to.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's a couple of questions here. I think this is maybe, I find this really an interesting aspect is, so you were pointing to some ways in which technology itself can be exclusive and also has bias designed into it or baked into it in some circumstances. How are we as teachers to navigate that if we're bringing these into the classroom? And especially the asker highlights that we ourselves have sort of always incomplete awareness ourselves or our own biases that we're bringing to that. Do you have some recommendations for how we can critically reflect ourselves on maybe ways in which we're, through these technologies, introducing bias or exclusion into the classroom?
That's a very important question, because the fact that we use these tools every day, and it's become so domesticated into our everyday life that it becomes invisible, right? It becomes so natural, right? I had one teacher in my research where I asked her, so, when you evaluate the digital literacy for your students, like, are there any patterns that you see? And it's just, oh, I recognize, like, the ones who use Apple they're more digitally literate. They're more savvy, right? In terms of, whereas those in the kind of like she called them lower end products are not as savvy. And then I take a look at the devices that she uses. It's a MacBook, it's an iPhone, right? And you realize, of course, people who would use the same technologies as you, the same operating systems, you would be able to read them as just as savvy as you, because these are things that you're familiar with, right? And the thing is, it's something that it's so easy to overlook. And that's where I think, again, I'll go back to the notion of allowing students a space to be able to bring in the text that they use, talk about the devices that they use. Is, like, I realize, because I myself am such an Apple user, but when I ask my students to talk about kind of like, oh, what does it look like on your phone, on an Android phone? And I learned, oh my gosh, it's completely different, right? That it actually becomes a space for us to realize these things that we take for granted, right? So it is approaching it in a way that you go into the classroom, not necessarily knowing everything from the start. Again, these biases that we have, we can't unearth it all before we step into the classroom. But I think it's that openness in interacting with our students and allowing their literacies and their different access to resources to be reflected more explicitly for us to understand our own biases as well.
I think that's a really important point, because sometimes we think about the access as just, do you have the technology, not what is it revealing to you once you start interacting with it, and how is that different for different devices. There's a question from Murat, which I'm actually really curious to hear your answer to this too. So for those of us who are not only educators, but education researchers, what are some of the challenges you see for carrying out research in this field? And are there particular areas around critical digital literacies as a research field that you are particularly excited about, or where you think more work needs to be done?
For sure. I think in other disciplines, like there's digital sociology, right, where they look at platform design, etc. When it comes to applied linguistics, when it comes to language learning teaching, more often than not, you have areas like computer assisted language learning, right, where again it is very much focused on the devices themselves. But one, I think the space of online genres is very key in terms of coming up with a meta language to be able to examine online texts so that teachers can then be able to know how to talk about these kind of like these different genres. And I'd say if you think about, let's say, a list of Google search results, right, where you have a highlighted term like that's hypertext, how there's a knowledge panel that appears on the right, how there's like three or four lines that are taken from the text that you're what words do we have for these things so that it's easy for us to refer to them if we're teaching students to skim through Google search results and determine which it is that they should click on, right? I think definitely in terms of understanding online genres and the meta language involved in that is important. And then I'd say another is understanding power and ideology in these online spaces. So again, that's the critical component, right? That the moment that we use these platforms, that there are ideologies embedded in them that we don't always see. And whether you call them neoliberal ideologies or ideologies of quantification and proceduralization, there are ways of being able to understand how these spaces of communication have deeply embedded biases, assumptions, and ideologies that we need to be able to articulate further.
I think you, for me at least, highlighted a really interesting aspect of that at the beginning of the talk with your example, where you were also pointing to that part of the effects of those language ideologies, and I'll take your term and say that neoliberal language ideologies is also which languages are oversourced or undersourced in these digital spaces, and the effects of those, I think, as well.
Mm-hmm.
There's just a lot of glowing comments that we'll make sure to share with you from the chat of people thanking you. I think you left us with some questions as educators about our comfort and our willingness and our own beliefs. And I feel like people are already pointing to the fact that you've kind of pushed us in both of those directions just through this presentation to maybe feeling a little bit more comfortable, at least trying to start reflecting on how we could become more comfortable with that. I do want to direct people there's a poll that's popping up there with some feedback that's very helpful for us for this webinar and future webinars, and for continuing to fund webinars like this. And then also that Kate is sharing a more open-ended, holistic survey that has feedback. I keep looking for questions, but instead I'm getting lots of people just thanking you for the wonderful webinar and the wonderful presentation and everything that you've shared with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's been great. Talking about this is really it's really something that I'm very passionate about, and I really hope that you've been able to take away something that'd be useful for your classrooms when you think about it later on. Thank you.